Perfect. So, hi, I'm Sushma, and I'm one of the data engineers at Dropbox, where I currently work on building a lot of data pipelines, and we do this in a serverless manner. So going into the talk, essentially, like, what is serverless? And the way I think about it is serverless is a new form of technology that's sort of evolved in the last decade. So maybe not that new, but what it did was it helped a lot of the startups to build and iterate and get their product to market really fast without having to worry about, oh, how will we deploy this? How will we do that? Because all of those services were available to them. And for us, one of our main use cases was specifically related to like the BI and analytics, because all of our data pipelines were metrics related to that particular business unit. And there's a bunch of them I listed that were the top factors from Event Serverless. And I'm going to dig deeper dive into the operational impacts. So you may wonder, like, what is an operational impact in this case? For our end users, our goal was to be able to get them their data in a really efficient manner, but also be consistent. And at the same time, if they had like additional changes, we were able to like react and respond to that and not have to wait for a couple of weeks or something to be able to deploy another feature or another project to do that. And this was something we were able to do easily because we had the whole serverless architecture, which helped us like be flexible and scale. I thought this was just a funny little GIF that talked about like what you have with legacy hardware versus no legacy hardware. And I think it helped us move really fast because we were not burdened by some of the old tools and infrastructure. But also at the same time, I want to call out really fast that not having some of the infrastructure that might exist also meant we had to build everything from scratch, and there wasn't anything we could automatically leverage or build on top of, which will have its own issues. So why serverless? Like, why did we choose AWS? Like, what was it about it that made it so appealing to us? And a big part of it was AWS has a really rich ecosystem of all these services that let us build all of our applications and pipelines with minimal amount of time required. We also, if something new came into the market, we were able to like test that to see if it fit in our use cases. And we also were able to manage costs pretty efficiently because you only pay for what you use and when you use it. So what are some of the main AWS services that we used for our data pipelining? We used S3, which was primarily where all of our data lived, and that was our data lake. And when we had to ingest any data or do any of that stuff, we used Lambdas, which is another AWS service that is used for short-lived computing. We also had external and internal tools we built that we also use for some of the data ingestion. In addition to that, for our ETL processes, we use something called step functions and glue, which are fairly simple to build out and orchestrate, and you can choose what runtime environment you want and how many of each resource you want. And all the code related to all of these parts were deployed in a serverless manner, again, using code commit, code pipeline, and code build, which was our CI/CD automation part. So what is a serverless, like what does our serverless orchestration look like? Most of our workflows are event-driven, which means anytime an event happens of some sort, there are a bunch of things we do. We persist any data related to that event. Then if that event is to invoke any particular services, it'll do that. And if it's scheduled, then it'll happen on a scheduled time. And the services, when invoked, they will go ahead and run. And some of these services, for example, are step functions, which is our managed ETL platform that we leveraged. Here is a high-level example of our architecture, and I'm going to let you guys take a look at it. It is pretty complex, but it actually isn't. There are currently, like, I believe, 160 data pipelines that we're running, and you want to be able to read this from right to left. So we have the data that we ingest data from, which goes into an S3 bucket, which is our data store, on top of which we have like event-driven triggers that go ahead, run, do a piece of work, and that could either be sticking some data into a MySQL database or an RDS database, or we trigger off a step function or a glue job, which is nothing but Amazon's ETL process, and then we persist data from that into Snowflake, which is our data warehouse. At the very bottom, you can also see our CI/CD deploy pipeline to deploy our code artifacts. And I'm going to take a deeper dive into step functions. So AWS step functions are nothing but a managed ETL process from Amazon, and you can think of it as states and tasks. Your states are the ones that will basically contain a particular state of a given event. And tasks are what actually do the work. These are your EC2 machines. These are your Lambdas. These can be a PySpark, data frames, or anything that'll crunch your data. And here's actually what a step function looks like, which is super, super simple in our case. So if you look, there's actually a start button, and then there's an init, there's a snow alert, fail, finalize, and end. What all of these are actually resources underneath it in Amazon. And what in this particular step function, what they are a piece of Python code. And Snowflake to S3, for example, basically it gets data from a database and sticks it into S3. It's a Python code, and if you look on the right side, in the block that says like Snowflake to S3, essentially it's a task, and what it does is it'll run for 300 seconds. And if it fails, it's going to go ahead, set an alert, and then it'll fail and persist that alerting message into a database. Or if it finishes and it finalizes, it just finishes up. One thing I want to call out in here is how easy it is to, if you want to add another step, if you want from Snowflake to S3, then you want to do another step in between, all it'll take is to add another piece of code on the left-hand side. That's basically a YAML file. And that's how we define our state machines, but underneath that are resources and pieces of code that actually execute each part. So we're separating everything out. It's a very microservice architecture, and it's also event-driven. Think of it as little Lego blocks that you can plug in and pop out depending on what you need. And so all of this sounds great, but that doesn't mean it was super easy to do some of this stuff. Some of the biggest things with AWS is they keep coming out with a lot of new services, all of which sound incredibly tempting and easy to use, but that's not always the case. And you want to find out what the limitations on each service are. Is it actually useful for your use case, or is the limitation something that's going to break your use case? One of the things we often saw was just the amount of data that some of the algorithms and forecasting models would need. One would work perfectly fine for one of the forecasting models, but wouldn't work for the other. So there's some of that things we need to understand better. And at the same time, we want to have the amount of logging and alerting. It's easy to get really do a lot of that, and that's not very useful if you can't figure out what the right alert or log that you want to get to. So you have to be careful on that. So that's pretty much it. Do you guys have any questions or anything that I want to answer? Please reach out to me, and happy to go ahead and dig in deeper. This is a lot of stuff in here.
Thank you so much, Sushma, for your presentation. Great presentation. If you have any questions, we have a little bit of time. We can answer them either if you have for either of the speakers. I know that there was one question. If you can share your slides to the audience somehow, if you have that ability. And also, how do you find that? Do you mean event bridge? Okay, here.
Slides, and I'm happy to post my email. I realize it's not in my slide, so
yes,
there we go. It's in there. So
how do I send a user when they even when they are not?
Yeah, so a lot of our notifications, we actually used SNS. What we have is we have an email that users subscribe to, and we use SNS for that. And we actually leverage SNS very heavily in all of our infrastructure.
Do you, if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to leave them down below. I want to thank you, Sushma and Pushkala, for your presentation. And thank you, everybody who attended this lightning talk. The next sessions will start in about 15 minutes. There's another question. Can you read it, or would you like me to read it?
So if you don't have an email, you basically will not know where to send it, right? So they need to be subscribed, or you can also put in an individual email, but they'll need to then what Amazon does is it'll send them a specific email to say, hey, can you confirm, can you verify this email essentially? And once you do that, you should be able to go ahead and send them an email. It's no different from when you subscribe to a mailing list or something and you get, hey, can you like confirm you actually subscribe to this? You get a similar thing.
Okay.
And how do you test out new AWS services to include in your new infrastructure? Honestly, I see another question, and I feel like part of that has just been doing POCs. What I tend to do is sometimes I'll just take like half a day once every 2-3 weeks and try it out and just see if it works or not. But it's easy to do your hello world applications is what I realize. The bigger part is trying to make sure that the limitations of that new service won't break your existing things. And again, like one thing that I tend to use a lot with AWS is just spin up a new host or use something called Cloud9. And that's what I tend to use to test my other stuff so it doesn't like mess up my existing services that we use. But also the beauty of the whole services is because it's sort of like a plug and play or like a Lego style thing, as I think in my head. If something breaks, it's easier for me to like take it out and just roll back.
Okay, great. Love Cloud9.
Yeah, that's just great. It's a very isolated programming environment, which I think and plays well with all of AWS services. So you truly get that isolation while having access to all the services and not having to set that up. There's very minimal infrastructure overhead.
Great. We have a few more minutes. If anyone else wants to ask any more questions, please feel free to write them below. What are your thoughts on being cloud agnostic?
So we specifically used AWS in part because it just had all the rich ecosystem of what we wanted to use. And some of the stuff was also pretty mature in terms of like just S3 and Lambdas. And that was a big part of it. GCP, we just didn't use it just because it was something we've never really used. And I think we went with AWS as a company. And in terms of like Azure, I feel like the whole Microsoft ecosystem is something that I've never taken a stab at, so I can't really speak for that. AWS just makes it easy, like to be honest, like it's just super easy. And they've been like the earliest to the game too, which means their offerings have also been like pretty rich. And their service system is also pretty good. Like I often go open up tickets with AWS and they respond almost right away.
That is true. They're very good at
That's been very helpful too, especially when you want to get something out, right? So POCs, and if you do the chat thing on that, it is so much faster because they'll do it right away as opposed to email or like a phone thing.
Yeah. I have a question also. How do you find their documentation? Do you find it like easy to navigate? Because I find it kind of hard sometimes. Like there's like a lot of information like scattered in places. I don't know if
you're like with the documentation. One thing also that's been really hard for me is they keep changing it all the time. Like I go in and like a month later, I'm like, oh wait, this API is doing something slightly different. So what I've actually gotten into the habit of going to the GitHub and actually seeing where the code is and seeing what the pull requests on some of that are and just see what's been updated. So that's kind of what I've been doing. And also I just read the documentation at the API level, just because I find the API level documentation a lot more clearer in addressing the questions compared to like what's on a higher level thing.
Yeah, that's true. There's a couple more questions.
Have you used a serverless framework from Nick Lopez? If yes, what do you think about it? What do you mean by a serverless framework? I'm not entirely sure, because everything we use is sort of serverless because we actually don't have a server we build and maintain. Oh, serverless.com. It's basically, no, I don't think we used it. I don't know what that is. And I've seen some of their documentation. So I've seen their documentation. I've used SAM from their stuff, some of the documentation they had on that, but I haven't used serverless. No. I've used SAM to deploy Lambdas, which is a way of doing serverless stuff. So Saranya and the AWS support option, because we are an enterprise account and we have the premium model, essentially we just open a case support system. And Paige, yes, I do code mostly in Python. I think I would like to be able to explore Go a little bit, which I haven't done. Most of our tech stack is essentially Bash. We still use Bash pretty heavily, Python, SQL for some of our data pipelines, and JavaScript.
Great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody who attended. Great talk. The next sessions will, another question.
So Gina, I work on a virtual, and like I know Windows virtual environment is actually like better than a Mac one, because with Python, some of the Mac dependencies when it comes to crypto libraries can get really messy. So one of the things, it's like Windows virtual machines have been great. At the same time, if you have access to be able to spin up an EC2 host and just do your work on that, like use the Ubuntu 18 and go ahead and just do all your work on that. But a VM on Windows machine should be something that should help you. I hope that's been helpful. And also look at the SAM stuff, because you can deploy, it creates a Docker container for you, and you can do your deployments in that. Like AWS SAM, I think.
Thank you, everybody. If you have any more questions, we have a few more minutes left. But thank you for joining.
Yeah, Windows and Python dependencies cannot be the greatest. What about just a regular VM in Windows? Okay. Well, that's it from my side.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. The next session will start in a bit, so you can go ahead and explore